Because We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
Thanks for joining us in our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in release order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers Infinity War this May. Robert Downey Jr. is back, at it again as Iron Man. After appearing in a cast full of superheroes a year before, how does Iron Man hold his own in a solo film? Does Marvel botch the portrayal of Iron Man's greatest long-term enemy? And will we ever get an Iron Man 4? Find out these answers and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Iron Man 3. Yo, listen up, here's a story about a little guy that lives in a blue world.
Nice.
So, Caleb, I thought that was one of the greatest openings to a Marvel movie yet, simply because that song has so much nostalgia for myself.
It's so catchy.
Great song. So this movie was released a year after the Avengers in May, correct?
That is correct.
Now, I was confused throughout this whole entire movie because this movie feels like a Christmas movie. There's snow. It takes place around Christmas time. They talk about Christmas. There's stockings and Iron Man and Tony Stark's home. Was this supposed to be released in December?
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because I had that in my notes and I just wasn't sure where to put it. No, this was never going to be a Christmas movie. The reason this is set during Christmas is because of the director, Shane Black, which we'll talk about, but his movies are almost always set during Christmas. It's kind of his trademark.
So Shane Black is the new director in this movie, which means Jon Favreau is out. Why didn't Jon Favreau return to film Iron Man 3? I mean, he did return, but not as the director.
Yeah, Zach. We talked a little bit about this. Actually, we talked a lot of bit about this in our Iron Man 2 podcast. Pretty much, Jon Favreau was not happy with the way that Iron Man 2 came out. He felt that the studio was interfering too much and causing him to insert those scenes like with the S.H.I.E.L.D. people, with Coulson and Fury, and he didn't enjoy that micromanagement. Originally, he was going to finish the trilogy, but because of that, he decided to walk away.
Was there any hard feelings? It couldn't have been too bad because he did come back to portray Happy once more.
I don't think there were any long-term hard feelings. Obviously, he felt something to decide he needed not to return. But ultimately, as you said, he does come back, so it's nothing that can't be fixed, whereas, you know, Edward Norton never ever comes back, so...
No, and I'm sure we'll never see Edward Norton ever again in the MCU. So we get Shane Black directing Iron Man 3. Shane Black as director is known for several, I guess, important movies in recent history. Are you familiar with any of his filmography?
No.
Now, after watching this movie, this felt distinctly different from Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2 as far as the cinematography and some of the filming aspects. At least I thought so.
Definitely. This is very much a different movie in pretty much every way possible. I mean, obviously it's still a Marvel movie, but the type of story is different. The setting is different. Even the action set pieces are very much different. And it's really a movie that's focused on the character of Tony Stark versus the idea of Iron Man. And that was a very deliberate decision that Shane Black had, because while he's the director, he was also the writer for this film.
Interesting. So what films has he done that are obviously set around Christmas?
Well, Zach, you know, in my research, I didn't write any of them down because I was going to talk about the ones I had seen, and because I hadn't seen them, I didn't write them down. Do you know any?
No, I actually thought I saw those in your notes. That's why I included that question. Sorry, I won't ask that
you're
question.
Good. That's probably the other people. I do know some other things about him. So the big movie that kind of got him this gig was a movie he did called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And he did that, and Robert Downey Jr. played a role in that film. And so when Jon Favreau stepped away, Robert Downey Jr. actually went to Shane Black and suggested to him that he should do this film, and that's how he ended up coming on board to both write and direct.
Now, Caleb, we mentioned in our Iron Man podcast that in 2006, Marvel went on stage at Comic-Con and announced the Mandarin would be the villain for Iron Man 1. Obviously, that didn't happen. Neither did we see anything for Iron Man 2. However, he is the main villain here in Iron Man 3. Was that intentional, or how did that come about?
From what I could see, I couldn't find very much about why they decided to do the Mandarin. My gut feeling is that it's the third movie. It's probably the last Iron Man movie they thought they were going to do at the time, and so they better do the Mandarin. I know that while this film was being written, Shane Black worked with Drew Pearce, who was a guy Marvel had originally hired to work on the script for the Runaways film, which is now a TV show on Hulu. And while Drew was working with Shane, Drew came up with the idea to have Mandarin be in the film, but it be a big twist. And I don't know if we want to spoil that now or if we want to wait till we get to the end, but that all came from Drew.
All right, so Drew Pearce, we need to find his house and egg it. Now, I wasn't very familiar with the Mandarin as a villain. I knew that he was a villain for Iron Man, a long-term villain, a main villain. Were you familiar with him at all?
I was not, and that's the case with a lot of these later Marvel movies. Because I'm such a Spider-Man guy, I know the Spider-Man villains, but these villains for the other big characters, I had no idea about.
As a long-term villain, the Mandarin actually appeared in Tales of Suspense 50. If you remember back in, I believe, our Iron Man podcast, or Iron Man 2 podcast, I talked about how Iron Man, when he was first created, he came out in the comics Tales of Suspense issue 39. So this is only about 11 comics later we see the Mandarin in the comic world. Now, his backstory is a little different than what we get in this movie.
Very different.
Very different. His backstory in the comics is that he was actually born to a very rich family that I believe was tied all the way back to Genghis Khan. And in a classic comic, classic superhero way, they both died. And so he was raised by his aunt who had all this angst against the world for no apparent reason. And so she used all that wealth to train him in science and martial arts. Why she decided to do that? Again, very angsty. It's this, very comic book version of him. And so anyways, of course, his aunt dies later. I couldn't really find the reason, but she dies. Okay. So he's all alone. Joining Superman and Batman and, later Iron Man and Spider-Man and all these other superheroes who now don't have any loved ones or parents. Anyways, the Mandarin travels around China, kind of doing his own thing, Danny Rand style. And finally, what he finds this crashed alien ship, and that's where he finds 10 rings that he puts on each finger that gives him the powers. Now, interestingly enough, this crashed alien ship comes from the planet of the Makalans. I don't know if I'm saying it right. I couldn't actually find a pronunciation. It's the Makalans or the Makluans. And it's basically a race of giant dinosaurs and giant dragons from another planet. One such dragon that you might be familiar with is Fing Fang Foom, a giant green dragon that's in the comics, and who I believe actually appears in Iron Man 3. But we'll get to that a little later.
Interesting. Yeah, you talked about his 10 rings. And if people have been paying attention, they'll notice that the terrorist organization that's been around since Iron Man 1, has been called the 10 Rings. And that is a direct reference to the Mandarin. And while they didn't have an overt presence in Iron Man 2, they were in that film as well. If you remember, Zach, Ivan Vanko gets a package with his passport and stuff in it. The person who gives that to him is a 10 Rings member. That's in the commentary and it's in some special bonus features. So they have had a presence through the entire Iron Man trilogy. So it really makes sense to make them the big bad for the third and final film.
Exactly. But what I was a little confused about for the Mandarin was that we see that he definitely has this Chinese heritage, this background, and he goes against a lot of these kind of fake Chinese, I don't know what you would call them, but, in America, kind of the tropes Yet it's done in this very terroristic Middle Eastern style, which we've seen in the first movie, and as you just mentioned, a little in the second. So is the Mandarin supposed to be from China, or is he supposed to be from like Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan?
So the comic version of the Mandarin is seen as a very racist stereotype, right, Zach? I mean, he's like an Asian
Correct.
old man, right?
Correct.
So for the movie version, they wanted to specifically avoid that. And so one of the ways they did that was they pretty much made him an amalgamation of a bunch of different cultures, very purposefully. So you're right, he's got some of that Asian influence going back to his comics. They've added some of that Middle Eastern influence here to make it a little bit more topical. And they bring all these things together. And there's actually a lot of little things about him that you can see throughout the film or production stills. For example, on the back of his neck, he has a tattoo of Captain America's shield with a giant Anarchy A through it. And that's supposed to represent him taking, these freedom ideas and co-opting them for his own use and twisting them into something else.
So he's a little bit of both.
He is a little bit of both. In fact, I think he's kind of based on Osama bin Laden, who was actually called out by name at one point in this film.
That's correct. So we have our villain, we have our director, who's not Jon Favreau, and we kind of have the setup of this Christmas movie being released in May. Are you ready to get into it?
Let's get into it.
All right, Caleb, so why don't you go ahead and read us the synopsis?
After saving New York from an alien invasion, billionaire Tony Stark copes with PTSD by building a legion of new and improved Iron Man suits. But deep in the shadows, a new menace called the Mandarin orchestrates a series of terrorist attacks across the globe. With his home demolished and his suits destroyed, Tony embarks on a personal journey to find out the truth about the Mandarin and stop him once and for all.
So this movie opens up and we're in Bern, Switzerland, 1999, and it is New Year's Eve, so it's Y2K is about to happen. And as I mentioned back in our Iron Man podcast, we get a Jensen cameo.
Yeah, he shows up here. You're exactly right. He's at the party. And this is actually the party that he was referencing in the first movie that he met Tony Stark in. And he's trying to introduce him to this guy, Dr. Wu, who in the film version, the version we got, is not important. But we'll talk about him a little bit later, so I wanted to point him out here because he's actually a very pivotal character.
Pivotal in the comics or pivotal in the movie?
Pivotal in the movie. The only issue is we don't really see it. There's actually a Chinese cut of this film where they got about 4 extra minutes of footage specifically for that market. And it explains some of the things that happens towards the end of this film that might not make sense otherwise.
We also see Happy with a mullet.
I saw him show up and I had completely forgotten about this. It was so funny.
If Jon Favreau could just keep that mullet, my life would be complete.
He looks like he should be in Pulp Fiction, doesn't he?
He really does. That's a good comparison.
With Sam Jackson, just swap him out. He can be the guy.
Now, not only do we see Jensen, but we're introduced to a couple new characters right away. The first of those being Maya Hansen, played by Rebecca Hall.
Yeah, so this is a character from the comic books, and this movie is primarily, inspired by the storyline of Extremis, or however you want to pronounce it, in the comic books. Zach, had you read that at that point, or even now?
No, I had not, and actually I had no idea she was from the comics. I suppose that she played a minor role, but other than that, I had no backstory connecting her with the MCU.
Okay, I hadn't read it either, so pretty much everything I know about this comic storyline is secondhand knowledge. But she is a character in that series, in that comic. Similarly, we're introduced to Aldrich Killian, played by Guy Pearce, who is also a character from that comic.
So which comic run are you talking about?
The Extremis storyline.
Issue number?
Good question. Don't know the issue numbers.
Volume number?
Man, I don't know. It was published in the 2000s at some point.
Okay. That doesn't help me at all.
Well, it's actually a fairly recent run. Like I said, it's published in the 2000s. It was very popular. That's the storyline that in the comics, Iron Man was able to basically store his armor inside his bone marrow, and so anytime he needed it, it would come out of his skin.
Very, very cool. And so in this kind of story arc, we get Tony going off with Maya and ditching Eldritch on the rooftop. But it's through this brief encounter that we get Eldritch's idea of pitching this new company, AIM. Now, AIM stands for Advanced Idea Mechanics. Were you familiar with AIM before this movie?
I think I had seen a little bit of them. I mentioned in our last podcast that I had watched Earth's Mightiest Heroes, the Avengers, and they are in a few episodes of that. But by and large, I was not very familiar with them when the movie came out.
So I was very familiar with AIM, as they're one of the criminal organizations that appears a lot in the crossovers or just in the Avengers films itself. So AIM was created by Baron Wolf... Films, comics, both. Well, both after Iron Man 3, correct?
Right.
So anyways, AIM was created by Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, who we'll actually see later in Captain America 2 and Avengers 2, because he was the same guy who created Hydra. So he created Hydra, and then he created AIM. Now, Hydra was that, terrorist organization that's kind of a counter shield. AIM, on the other hand, is supposed to support Hydra. It's a group of super smart scientists. They have very comic booky designs, so they're all in yellow radiation outfits.
Yeah, they kind of look like those things from Monsters, Inc. that come down and, shave the poor guy.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And, Hydra doesn't have the best outfits as well. And later on in the comics, AIM... their kind of leader is M-O-D-O-K, or Modok, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who is basically this floating brain. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. He's a face, and his cranium is so large that he has this kind of tiny body, and this body is in this floating chair. And so he's just super intelligent.
Yeah, it's hard to even call it a body. I mean, it's basically arms and legs sticking out of his head.
That's right. So, I knew AIM from that perspective. It's pretty big in the comics, and it's one of the antagonists that fights against S.H.I.E.L.D.
One thing I wanted to mention in this opening is Aldrich Killian is wearing an AIM t-shirt, and the logo looks like the old, or maybe current, IBM logo, where it's blue and it's got the lines through it. I just thought that was funny. It really tied into the 90s theme. That's
a great Easter egg. Now, we follow Tony and Maya, who go back to Maya's apartment to have a little science fun.
Fondue.
That's right, some fondue. And it's here that we actually get a sort of Easter egg and plot device. Well, it's not a plot device for the movie, but it's a plot comic strain that the movie kind of takes off in the comics. And what I'm talking about here is where Happy kind of picks off a branch from this plant, and Maya's like, "Oh no, don't! The plant doesn't like it." And Happy's going it's a plant, right? And so then Maya and Tony go into the bedroom, and Happy plucks the entire branch off, and then we later see that it grows. So this is our first hint at the extremists, as well as an interesting storyline. So to jump into that, Caleb, do you know a lot about the Man-Thing?
Not really. In fact, for a while, I actually kind of confused him with Swamp Thing.
So Swamp Thing is from DC, Man-Thing is from Marvel. They're both these hulking creatures. They kind of look like the Hulk, but they're more natural. They have branches, vines, weeds, and they protect kind of planet Earth. To be honest, I'm not really sure if Marvel or DC came up with the idea first, but the other company kind of copied off this look.
As they normally do.
Exactly. So anyways, this plant is actually a callback to the comics and a callback from Man-Thing. If you look into his origins, he was started by Dr. Ted Salas, who was conducting top secret research on plants in the Everglades. Now his wife, Ellen, betrays him to AIM, which is interesting. So they actually get married. He kind of moves them to conduct this research. And after recently getting married, how the comic book, those early golden age comic books put it, is that Ellen just got jealous that he was spending so much time with plants. So she went to a criminal organization and reported him.
Wow.
Going to extremes.
I mean, that's the first thing I think of.
You better watch out for Courtney.
No.
And so being trapped, Dr. Salas decides to inject himself with this untested formula, turning himself into this man-thing. Now, okay, this has a sort of a tie into AIM, but his wife's name is Ellen Brandt. Ellen Brandt, as we'll later talk about, is the same name as the female AIM agent who battles Tony when he's in Tennessee. She even has a scar on her face, which in the comic books, Ellen Brandt, the wife, gets a scar on her face after, I believe, she attacks the Man-Thing or the Man-Thing attacks her, one or the other. So it shares a lot of these similarities with Iron Man 3 that you might not have caught if you're just watching it.
That's actually really, really cool.
So after 1999, we get transported to present-day Stark's house. First question right off the bat. Why are we in Stark's house? He just bought a giant tower, and he was living there in the Avengers, if I'm correct.
So we don't get a clear indication of how far after the events of Avengers this film takes place. My assumption is Stark Tower got trashed. And as we'll see in Avengers Age of Ultron, it gets renovated to become the Avengers Tower. So my assumption is at this point, they're currently renovating it. And Tony's not going to do that himself. He's got a crew out there, or he's got drones, or someone's doing it. And he's gone back to Malibu to live in his house until it's done.
Now we also see his new armor, Mark 42. So Tony Stark has been extremely busy because the last armor we encountered was Mark 15.
Not even. The armor in Avengers was Mark 7, 8. We got 1 through 3 in the first Iron Man, 4 through 6 in the second Iron Man, and yeah, Mark 7 in Avengers. So he's been very busy.
And you're right, we only get a mention of Mark 15. We actually don't even see it.
Yeah, and this is a big plot point of this movie, is that Tony, and we find out here and through the next several scenes, Tony is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from the events that happened in the Avengers. He went into that black hole, the aliens were coming out. He doesn't know how to process this, right? So his response is to constantly build suits because he feels that he needs them in order to be safe and ready for any attack that might happen.
And this is a story arc that carries through Avengers Age of Ultron. But going back to Mark 42, this suit of armor is actually highly different from the suit of armor we get in the comics, Model 42. Model 42, if you're familiar with the comics, is what I believe is a sweet-looking suit of armor that's yellow and black. So its main color is kind of black, and it has these yellow highlights around it. And it adds some upgrades, but that's about it. Versus this Mark 42, which is red and silver, and adds a lot more upgrades.
Well, it's actually red and like beige. And I remember when they unveiled this suit at Comic-Con, people were like, no, too much beige, too much tan, we need more red. And I kind of agree with them personally. But yeah, it's a major upgrade. He can basically call different pieces to the suit individually, and they will snap onto him. But this is not a completed suit of armor. This is actually a prototype. Mark 42, the entire thing is a prototype. It's not Mark 42 - the prototype, and then Mark 42 - the completed one. Mark 42 is the prototype, and then assuming 43 would be the completed suit. But that's why sometimes the suit doesn't act the way you would expect in this movie.
So it's right after this scene that we get interrupted by some TV broadcasting, and we get our first glimpse at the Mandarin, played by Ben Kingsley.
A lot of these scenes were actually added in reshoots, but it's basically flashes of a video that he sent in to terrorize the world.
Now these videos, for me, are very strange, because on one hand, they seem extremely dark. They're probably the most intense footage we've gotten since the Iron Man 1 footage in Afghanistan. On the other hand, and I credit this to Ben Kingsley's acting, not that his acting was bad in this movie, but simply that there's something also off about these clips. It's like, it's dark, but it doesn't feel right. And I don't want to say it's comedic, but it's just strange.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think that they didn't want to go just straight up intimidating, because we've seen so many comic book movies like that. I think they were trying to give the Mandarin some personality, and there are moments that are a little bit funny in a dark kind of way in these scenes, but for me, this really works. Watching it the first time, I don't remember what my reaction was to it, but I could totally see how maybe you're not sure about it. But I loved it, and actually, we mentioned the 10 rings earlier. I don't know if you can see it in this scene, but supposedly one of the rings that he actually wears 10 rings in this movie. They're not magical or alien like they are in the comic books, but one of the rings that he wears in this movie supposedly is the ring that Raza wore in the first Iron Man film. And Raza was that Middle Eastern bald guy who was kind of the main villain of the 10 rings in that film.
Now, Caleb, just like our podcast was tested well with focus groups, we also see the Iron Patriot that was tested well with focus groups. So to combat these terroristic TV broadcasts, the president shows off War Machine, which has had a complete redesign as the Iron Patriot.
And another thing that people mention about the Iron Patriot armor in this film is they say, oh, it's the same suit, they just gave him a paint job. It's not actually the same suit at all. I don't know what they're referring to. This is a very different suit than we saw in Iron Man 2. I guess Tony is now on board with Rhodey having a suit, and he built him a new one. But it definitely is painted differently. Now, Zach, you probably know more about this than I do, but in the comics, it's not Rhodey that wears a suit of armor.
That's correct. It is Norman Osborn. For those of you who might not know that character's name, Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin, the same Green Goblin that fights Spider-Man. So in the comics, Norman Osborn actually replaces Tony Stark as head of S.H.I.E.L.D. So actually, as S.H.I.E.L.D. goes, Nick Fury isn't the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. Maria Hill isn't the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. Tony Stark becomes the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. and then is replaced by Norman Osborn. So a lot of being replaced, right? That's if you're trying to have longevity, don't become the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. because it won't work. So Norman Osborn becomes the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., renames it to Hammer, which I'm not really sure what it stands for, but it stands for something around defense, and I don't even know. But you get the idea. Instead of being more of a shield to block Earth, they're a hammer that's just going to destroy anybody that gets in their way. And as Hammer, Norman Osborn, being a villain himself, assembles a group of other villains, but they can't just go parading around as villains, so they disguise themselves as heroes and call themselves the new Avengers. For example, they have Hawkeye on their team, but he isn't Clint Barton. This Hawkeye is actually Bullseye, the villain from Daredevil, if you're familiar with that movie or the comic strains at all, right? And so Norman Osborn has to kind of take up another mantle other than the Green Goblin. So he dons the War Machine armor and instead has this mix of he needs Captain America on the team, but there is no Captain America because they're villains. So he decides to rebrand it as the Iron Patriot. Same design as we see in this movie, just different person.
So while in the comics he's more of a villainous character, this film takes that and twists it so he's more of a heroic character.
Exactly.
Moving on from this scene, we jump to a bar where we find Rhodey and Tony talking. And this is where we get a lot of information about the Mandarin and what he's been doing. There's been 9, I think, bombings that he's enacted. And we get our first actual taste in the film of Tony's PTSD.
What did you think of this PTSD? Now, it was brought on in the form of an anxiety attack, and I know that PTSD can affect people in different ways. For Tony, it feels definitely warranted as I was thinking about it, because he was the only one that went up into space and saw everything. No other Avenger saw what he saw. So I love the idea of kind of how this starts. What did you think?
I am totally on board for this. It's not the direction I thought they were going to take. It's not the direction I would have taken, but I'm glad that they took it that way. You're right, he was the only one to go in space, but also, he's a man that is very, very steeped in science, things that he can explain, things that he can have control over. And an alien invasion is something that he doesn't have any control over, and I think that's also part of why he gets this PTSD, but it is severe. And so he gets this basically because a kid comes up and is showing him this drawing of him in the Battle of New York.
How "How did you escape the black hole?
How did you escape the black hole?"
And he freaks out.
He totally freaks out, and he has an anxiety attack, and he walks outside. It's a very tense moment. Now, I want to take a break from that for a second and just ask you, Zach, do you leave your Iron Man suits just parked by the curb?
Of course, for any rascal to climb into and fly away.
I mean, I know it's got safety measures against people climbing in it and taking it, but what if someone just grabs a bunch of chains and ties it to a truck and drives it away?
Well, Caleb, this works for me because, as we'll later see more of in the scenes, Mark 42 is his new bodyguard. Happy can't really be bodyguard for Iron Man anymore, and he later becomes the bodyguard for Pepper Potts, which is the scene directly right after this. And so Tony Stark needs a new bodyguard, which is that Iron Man suit. It's kind of his new bodyguard. It takes a life of his own when he's doing other things.
Okay, yeah, I could go for that. That actually makes a lot of sense. And something else we see in this film for the first time is, again, the evolution of the suit. He can pretty much walk into his suit from any angle at this point, and it just opens up and he gets right in.
So after this, we visit Stark Industries, where we do see Pepper Potts as CEO. So this answers our questions that we had in the Avengers. Pepper is still the CEO of Stark Industries.
And this is established that we're at the Stark building and this wide establishing shot. Is this a new building? Because it doesn't look like any of the buildings that we've seen before.
Yeah, I think this is a new compound. It would make sense, Pepper being the CEO maybe moves the headquarters as they start focusing on energy and environmental protection, or, whatever, healthy energy over weaponized products.
So in this scene, basically, we see that Pepper has a meeting with someone. And before it's revealed who it is, she says that she used to work with him. But he's been working, we find out it's Aldrich Killian, but he's been working at AIM since at least 1999. And Pepper wasn't in that scene, so I'm assuming she wasn't with Tony yet. Does that mean that she worked for AIM at one point?
I caught that dialogue and I dismissed it, but that's a good question. I have no idea. What I do know is that Eldritch Killian had a junior high makeover since we last seen him in 1999. He was looking like those awkward pictures that we have on Facebook that you just want to delete and that you probably should have deleted years ago. But now he is fully grown and looks like a great CEO of AIM.
Not only is he fully grown and looks like a great CEO, this guy actually looks very cleaned up and almost like some guy that would be in a magazine or something. I don't know about you, Zach, but I have a little bit of an issue with the way he's portrayed in 99. I don't hate it, but it seems a little bit pandering. Like, instead of just making him unlikable or easily ignored, they went full on, 1980s style nerd, where he's got the glasses and the super long hair. He can't even walk up straight. He can't talk right. I think he's got acne covering his face. I don't know if I'm down for that kind of thing.
No, I mean, I think it works. As a viewer, you kind of take pity on him, or at least I did, right? I didn't think he was annoying. In fact, I'm like, oh, Tony Stark is a little harsh on this guy who's one of his biggest fans. And I think that's what the movie's trying to get you to do, to pity him. And so when he later comes into full view right here, you're like, oh, dang.
So he comes in, and obviously Pepper is very shocked because he does look so good, and they have a meeting, and he's basically pitching her the idea of extremis. And in this scene, I don't really know what extremis is in this movie. In this scene, he says that it unlocks your potential. He says that it's basically gene editing, I think is what he says. There's a spot in the brain that's empty. I don't know what that has to do with gene editing. I don't know if you need that empty spot maybe to grow the new part of the brain to control your new powers. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But for some reason, this only manifests itself in this film with one set of superpowers. But anyway, Pepper decides to pass on this offer to work with him because she sees it as highly weaponizable, and she thinks that Tony will also agree with her and not be for it. So it seems like even though Tony's not the CEO of the company, he still has some say.
So while Pepper Potts is parading around with Killian, we go back to the Stark house and we see that Tony's kind of been chilling. Tony's been making more armor, upgrading more armor, and we get a couple really interesting Easter eggs. The first is that Tony mentions Mark 15 when Pepper Potts actually also goes to the Stark house, approaches him about, I can't remember what, and asks him what suit of armor he has on, he's making. Now, us as the viewer know it's Mark 42. He lies and states it's Mark 15. Do you know a lot about the Mark 15 armor, Caleb?
I looked up all of his armors in the comics for these recordings, and so I've seen them, but I don't know specifically which one that is.
Yeah, so Mark 15 stands out because this is Model 15 in the comics, and why it stands out is he has these oversized gauntlets attached to each arm. He's a little more shiny, a little more bulkier, a little more intimidating, and these gauntlets have different weaponized abilities. So if you're familiar with any of the comic runs, kind of in the early 2000s, you've probably seen what I'm talking about. Now, in the movie, they changed that a little bit because later on in the movie, you will actually see the Mark 15 suit, which is known as Sneaky. It's kind of the silver stealth armor prototype.
Also, while we're here, we notice that his house has gotten a makeover. Why, you might ask? It's because he blew it up in Iron Man 2 with his fight with War Machine.
And this is more of an aesthetic makeover. The layout pretty much feels the same.
That's true. The other important thing we learn in this scene is that not only can he enter his suits from any angle, but his suits can also be piloted externally. So he no longer has to be inside the suit.
That's right. And it's during this scene, this kind of piloting scene between Stark and Pepper, that in the background, did you notice that kind of pile of garbage that was sitting around?
Are we talking about in his workshop or upstairs?
In his workshop. If you look kind of near the staircase, it looks like modern art.
Oh, yes, I did notice that. I was wondering if maybe that was something from the Battle of New York.
Wrong. But close. This is actually an Easter egg from Iron Man 2. If you look closely, that balled up wreckage is his F1 car from Iron Man 2 that Whiplash destroyed. So it's kind of balled up together and it's placed right there as part of this redesign in his house.
And that's totally something Tony would do, and that's really, really funny. We also learn in the scene that Pepper has moved in. The relationship is going well, so they're living together. And then we jump to a scene at night with Tony trying to sleep.
That's right. The relationship does not go well there, as Tony is having an episode, and Pepper tries to wake him, and the armor attacks Pepper. Now, Caleb, we see Tony kind of lunge at the armor, and in one move, he breaks it in one punch?
So, we didn't talk about it, but earlier in the movie, when we're first introduced to the Mark 42, that scene actually starts with Tony putting this thing on his arm and injecting stuff. What he's actually doing is injecting microcontrollers or microcomputers into his arms, and these act as markers that, one, can identify where his arms are, and two, can follow the movements of his arms. So what he's done is pre-programmed in specific arm movements that are commands to the suit. And he actually does two movements. He does one, which causes the suit to stop. And then he does this other, which kind of looks like he's swinging a sword, which causes it to fall to pieces. So they're actually commands. He's not just swinging his arms around.
Okay, that makes much more sense. And for me, this is really the only PTSD scene that actually works. Now, I think that's because it's more visual, so we see what Tony Stark is seeing, right? He's reliving what he relived in the Avengers movie that's causing these anxiety attacks. But other than this scene, Caleb, no other anxiety attack really works for me. Now, granted, I'll be honest, I don't have PTSD, I don't have anxiety, and so I can't really speak from experience, but I feel like I have seen this portrayed more accurately in other movies, or in Tony Stark's position, there just doesn't seem like there's a lot of weight. And in some instances later on in the movie, it almost seems humorous more so than realistic.
Well, I do have some issues with the way that this is played out in the film. My issues have more to do with how it progresses versus how it's handled. Now, just like you, I don't have any experience with this, so I can't say. But it is something that, personally, I feel they handled fairly well when it comes up. One thing that is in this scene that I wish would come back up again is basically his suit malfunctioning. It comes up and he says that it's not supposed to move when he's asleep or something to that effect, and that never comes back again. Typically, that's something in a film that you would reference in the beginning, and it would come back as a major plot point later, but it doesn't.
Now, it's after this that, while Pepper and Tony have been kind of interacting, that we see that Happy has taken some initiative and has followed a shady figure that he saw in the Stark headquarters, Eric Saven.
Yeah, this guy came in with Aldrich Killian, and we assume that he's maybe his bodyguard, and he didn't play well with Happy there. So Happy, like you said, followed him, and he follows him to the Chinese theater, and he's pretty much dealing drugs.
That's kind of what you think, right? So he meets another person, gives him a briefcase, Happy intercepts that, and then there's kind of this scene where whoever had that briefcase inhales this, which you later find is the extremist. And he is addicted, which is kind of like this side plot of the extremist, which is you can use it and it powers you up, but you can't become addicted with it or you'll explode. And so this guy explodes, Happy goes into a coma, and Eric Saven, as you find out, has this inside of his body. Now, this is probably a good time to talk about extremists. What really is this? Is this some fire powers you get? Does it change your biological makeup? Or as you mentioned previously, is it simply a DNA slicer that has something to do with your brain?
So, as far as I can tell, in this film, Extremis does two things. One, it increases your rate of recovery, which is what I think Aldrich says in his meeting with Pepper. And so these guys, whenever they have damage done to them, they can heal it very quickly. And I mean like more than Wolverine quickly. Like his arm gets blown off and he regrows another one. So it does that. The other thing it does is it gives them like heat powers. So they can generate heat in their hands and their body. They can withstand heat. And that's actually what causes that one guy to blow up. And I'm also not sure if that's just because of overdose. There's some things that happen later in the movie which makes me think some people are just going to blow up regardless of what they do.
That one person that does blow up, he's actually an Easter egg. So his name is Jack Taggart. I mentioned this, I believe, in the Avengers movie. And so at the end of the Avengers movie, in that clip with the news broadcast, we see Senator Boynton. And now Senator Boynton. So Senator Boynton, as I mentioned again previously, issued Project Firepower, which was basically another suit of armor to an individual, Jack Taggart. This is all in the comics. And he was a villain of Iron Man. So he appears briefly in this scene, which is kind of an Easter egg and a nod towards the comic books.
Now, when I was watching this in theaters, Zach, I thought that they had just killed Happy. It made complete sense to me because Jon Favreau didn't want to come back to direct, so they were probably going to try to sever ties with him, close out his character, but they didn't want to have to worry with bringing him back. And while he's laying there, he looks completely done.
Yeah, I thought they'd killed him as well. For me, though, this doesn't necessarily carry a lot of emotion, right? And so Coulson in the Avengers, that was extremely sad. This, he looks like he's dead. I'm like, oh, okay, they killed him off.
I had the opposite reaction. I was actually very concerned until we jump to the next scene where he's in the hospital and he's still alive.
Yeah, so immediately after this, we're in the hospital. There's a funny little shtick where Tony Stark makes sure that Happy has Downton Abbey playing, because Downton Abbey was kind of the rave when this movie came out.
And actually, it was Jon Favreau's idea for that to be a character trait because he personally loves Downton Abbey.
Love it.
And so Tony walks outside and he's greeted by a whole bunch of news reporters, right? And they basically ask him when somebody is going to kill the Mandarin. And he takes off his glasses and he issues this sort of threat to the Mandarin. Zach, is this a real threat? Or is he just kind of appeasing the news reporter? Because he immediately takes that phone and throws it against the wall like he doesn't want it to be seen.
No, it's a real threat. I think you just take that news reporter's phone. It's still being recorded, right? And it's a threat that's coming from a place of, you attacked my best friend Happy, now I'm going to kill you. Which makes sense because immediately after this, we go to the Stark house and a ton of things happen at once. First, Maya appears again, out of nowhere. Pepper Potts is also in that house. As we mentioned, she's living there. And then that house is attacked because previously Tony gave out the address to where he lives.
That's right. And when we actually jump to this scene, before we get to Maya, we see Stark trying to figure out how the explosion happened in the Chinese theater. And this scene is important because he finds some other people and realizes that he needs to go to Rose Hill, Tennessee, and he asks Jarvis to plot a flight path for him. Also in this scene, I thought that it was very, very much probably inspired by, it looks the same as any of those crime scene reconstructions in any of the Arkham games, the Batman Arkham games, if you've played those, Zach.
Yeah, I have. I thought this could definitely be a callback to the games. We'll never really know, but it was very interesting, and I loved how the technology was used.
So fast forward, and Maya is there, and she's trying to get their help, and then those helicopters come and immediately attack the house.
So I have some questions for this, Caleb. So the first thing we see is when it attacks the house, Tony Stark selflessly throws the Iron Man suit on Pepper Potts. Now, he obviously doesn't throw it. He calls it to her so it attaches to her. Previously, you had mentioned that for Stark to be able to do this, he actually injects himself with whatever nanochips or whatever so he's able to control it. Does this mean that he has secretly injected Pepper Potts with some type of nanochips? Or do those nanochips allow him to attach the Mark 42 to whoever he wants to?
That's a good question that I hadn't actually thought about. My assumption is that those chips, now that you've said that, are only for those commands that he issues with his arms, right? It reads the commands. So when he gives a command for it to attach to her, it uses visual sensors or whatever kind of sensors it needs to and just immediately forms around her. But of course, this is also a reference to Rescue, which we've mentioned a couple times before in the Iron Man comics, which I did find out was something in the comics that happened between 2009 and 2012. The other thing, Zach, before you move on for this scene, I want to mention is that the music in this scene sounds eerily like the Avengers theme.
I did feel like this was very Avenger-y music. And talking about the Avengers, where are the Avengers? This is the first movie to come out after the Avengers have gathered together, right? So they kind of have to answer that question. And I think they answer the question by not even talking about it. Because in this scene, we have helicopters attacking a house in California. Okay, first, even if the Avengers weren't scrambled, there should have been jets in the sky or some type of awareness, right? Like, for example, where's Rhodey? Second, Tony Stark, after the scene, is presumed dead. Because after Pepper Potts and Maya are in safety, Tony Stark gets the suit back on. He takes out a couple more helicopters, but then he kind of gets crushed by all this rubble. He's down in the ocean. He barely escapes. His suit takes off. We don't know where. I thought he was coming back to finish off that helicopter, but we find out later that's inaccurate. And the helicopter flies away. And we're led to believe that Pepper thinks he's dead for like a hot second, and that the news reports have been reporting that Tony Stark is dead. If Tony Stark actually died, I feel like the Avengers would have been called back to hunt down whoever killed him, or to at least make sure they could find his body. Why were they never mentioned at all?
Well, that was a big question fans had after this film, is how are you going to explain them not coming together? And you're right, they do kind of explain that by not explaining it at all. For this scene in particular, I don't think that there's any way anybody could have gotten to the house in time. I don't think that there would be jets close enough. I don't think that the Avengers would be close enough. So it doesn't really matter for that particular part of it. As far as him being dead, you're right. They should have come back and investigated. But maybe when he uploaded that message, which we'll see in a scene later, that he's still alive, and that's how Pepper finds out he's still alive. Maybe S.H.I.E.L.D. has access to that, and they give that information to everyone, because the only other Avengers are going to be S.H.I.E.L.D. people, right? It's Black Widow, it's Hawkeye, it's Captain America, and then maybe Bruce Banner, which shows up at some point in this film, but S.H.I.E.L.D. could have let him know as well. But Thor is off-world, so he would have no way of knowing.
True. It just doesn't make sense that not even Nick Fury makes an appearance here. So Iron Man is at the bottom of the ocean, and the last kind of scene is he's escaping. He looks like he's awake. and he flies out of the water, and he just flies in a separate kind of direction. And then the next scene we get is Tony Stark wakes up after Jarvis is like, all right, sir, I only have 3 minutes left, or we're here. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he wakes him up, right? So question number 1, so did Tony Stark pass out because he looked like he was awake? Question number 2, I know that the flight pattern was already established through Jarvis, but Jarvis is pretty smart. If Tony Stark was out, he would have turned around and gone back to his house. He wouldn't have plotted a flight pattern to Rose Hill, Tennessee.
So as far as him being passed out, there's actually a shot after he comes out of the water where you do see him pass out. And that's what leads directly into the next shot where you see he's in a different place. For Jarvis, Tony had asked him to plot that path specifically because he was going there, right? When he's under all the rubble, Tony just says, get me out of here. And so instead of taking the computational time to come up with a new path, Jarvis just sends him to the very first one he had. And while Jarvis is smart, he's not all-knowing. And, I mean, it actually kind of makes sense. There is just an attack on the house. You want to get as far away from there as you can. So it is a little strange, but I don't have an issue with it.
Okay, to me, it doesn't make any sense, and I thought that part really didn't work in the flow of the movie.
So as you said, Tony wakes up here. The world thinks he's dead. The suit dies at this point after he crashes, and he has to take it off. We see him then carrying the suit, dragging it through the snow, because it's snowing here in Tennessee, which, by the way...
It never does.
I live close to Tennessee, guys. It does not snow like that in Tennessee unless it's, like, really, really crazy. That's not a normal thing.
But it's a Christmas movie.
Yeah, whatever. But he's dragging his suit through the snow. His suit is reassembled at that point. How did he reassemble the suit if it's dead? And it was in, like, 50 pieces or something?
Because he's Tony Stark, man. The smartest man in the world. No, I actually didn't like Mark 42 at all. I thought in some places, like you just said, how did it reassemble itself? It seems like extremely strong. But in other places, it seems way too fragile. As we'll see later on in the movie, he rescues a bunch of people from an airplane, and then it simply runs into a truck and breaks into a million pieces. So in some ways, it seems like it's really strong, and in other ways, it's like very fragile, which I don't think really works well.
Well, to me, that's explained away by the fact that it's a prototype. It's not finished. And so it is going to be more fragile and unpredictable than a regular suit of armor would. Because he's never actually supposed to take this out in the field. The only reason he does is because his house was attacked in the middle of testing it.
Now, it's in this scene in Rose Hill, Tennessee, that we get introduced to a new character, Harley Keener, played by Ty Simpkins.
This little guy is, I think, a pretty good actor for this film. I don't have a lot of issues with child actors. I know some people do, but I feel like he does a great job here.
Yeah, and Ty Simpkins not only was in Iron Man 3, but a couple years later, he actually also starred in Jurassic World. He was the boy that starred alongside Star-Lord, which came out in 2015. Now, for me, Jurassic World seemed like it came out last year, but 2015, that was 3 years ago.
Yeah, I had that issue recently. I saw a thing for Ender's Game, and I was like, 2013? What? That came out a year or two ago.
Now, Harley knew who Iron Man was, but he didn't know who Tony Stark was, because when he sees him, he's like, who are you? Tony Stark moves, sees the Iron Man suit. He's like, oh, you're Iron Man. And then Tony Stark's like, no, I'm the mechanic. Because he's like, what's your name? I'm Harley. He's like, what's your name? He's like, I'm the mechanic. So how did this kid know who Iron Man is, but not know who Tony Stark is?
Yeah, I thought that was strange, too. I don't know. Maybe it's similar to, like, an actor. Kids will recognize characters actors play, but they don't know who the actual actor is, because this kid is still pretty young.
So I just want to briefly mention that we jump back to Tony's household. We see the wreckage. Pepper basically finds out that Tony's still alive through a message that he left her. And Maya and Pepper start heading out somewhere else. But it's in this scene that we see the FBI picking up the wreckage. Again, where is S.H.I.E.L.D.? Where is Nick Fury? Why is the FBI here instead of S.H.I.E.L.D. when it pertains to an Avenger?
I didn't even notice that it was the FBI, but That's a question I have in parts of this movie too. This is the first MCU movie with absolutely zero SHIELD presence. I don't think they're mentioned at all. I don't think they're brought up at all. I don't think it's on any screens. It is completely without SHIELD. And I think that Marvel was trying to do this to separate themselves a little bit from the idea of the shared universe, because the entire first phase was a build up to the Avengers, right? It was a success. You don't just want all the movies following to be a build up to the next movie. They need to be able to stand on their own. And so I think that's why some of these decisions were made, but I agree some of them don't make sense.
Yeah, they were trying not to repeat the sins of Iron Man 2.
Yes, let's stay far away from those sins.
Now, another short kind of reveal is that we also get another montage of the Mandarin, but we also get a small reveal in here, and that we see Eldritch Killian filming somewhere with the Mandarin. So that automatically shows the viewer, A, the Mandarin must be in the States, B, Killian and the Mandarin are now working together, and C, my wife has only seen this movie once, and she had no idea of the plot twist, which we'll talk about in a second. But after seeing that short reveal, she's like, oh, okay, I knew they were filming all of this. So she knew something strange was going on.
Yeah, it is a big reveal that Aldrich is there. I didn't think that this revealed anything more than the fact that they are purposely putting out these videos, which even if they were doing this stuff for real, which some of it they are, you still have to film it. You still have to have a film crew. And to me, this was kind of more of a commentary on modern society and kind of the efforts we will put into these things, even if they're terrorist attacks. Because even if someone was doing this in real life and they were putting out the exact same things, they would have all that equipment. They would have the set. They would make it as terrifying as possible. Because remember, these people are terrorists. Their goal is to instill panic and terror and cause chaos. And the better production values you have, the better you can do that.
So we jump back to Rose Hill, and I believe that Harley and Tony actually have the best relationship in the entire movie. It's kind of funny. Tony plays, his character where he doesn't really care about Harley, tells him to grow up, but later we find out, he has a slight hole in his heart just for Harley. And I think it works. I think Harley holds his own really well, and it's just a fun relationship to watch.
And this is also the part of the movie where the character-centric idea is really brought to the forefront. Tony, as we mentioned, is experiencing PTSD. He feels he has to have the suit to be safe, right? It's his armor. It's what makes him ready. And what this movie does, for the majority of it, is they take that suit away from him. They take the safety blanket away from him. And it's an exploration into the character of Tony Stark himself, separately from Iron Man, and how he's going to handle situations without the suit. Because as much as we've seen Tony Stark in all these MCU films, except for that very brief part in the beginning of Iron Man, we have never seen him without a suit. And so this is our really first insight into his psyche.
That's very, very true. So moving the plot forward, Tony goes to a bar to find the soldier who exploded himself in Rose Hill, Tennessee, his mother, and his mother is expecting someone else. She is expecting an AIM agent, Ellen, who I talked about earlier, who now encounters Tony. So then we have a fight scene between this AIM agent, Ellen, and Tony Stark, as well as the evil bodyguard, Eric Savan, who also appears in this fight scene. So a couple questions for you, Caleb. In this fight scene, we see the AIM agent, as Tony Stark is running away, grab a shotgun, and she fires it through the window at Tony, and Tony jumps behind this random shop that he dove into for cover. He jumps behind the bar, and he ducks down. In 1 second, he gets back up, and he peeks around the corner to see where she is coming, and she is right in his face, which means in 1 second, she is able to travel about 50, 60 steps. And not only that, but the shotgun she had, where she was trying to kill Tony with, she just threw it away after only firing it once.
This could be one of two things. The first thing, which is what I actually think it is creative license, right? This is a movie. It's meant to be dramatic. It's meant to make us feel. And so this is a jump scare, right? The second possibility, if you want an in-universe explanation, is we will see at the end of the film, these guys are really strong, like really strong. So she could have just jumped over there. And also, she doesn't really need the shotgun at all. She can kill him without it.
And as we found out, Tony Stark's autobiography could be written with a cheesy one-liner
and a cheap trick.
Now, the other thing that doesn't work for me here, even though it's a pretty cool scene, is that after Tony Stark takes out the AIM agent, the other AIM agent, Eric Savan, comes after him, and it is revealed that Tony has this weapon that he has hidden. It's a kind of one-use repulsor blast, which I thought was pretty cool that he's had this, but why did he save it up to this point instead of using it on the other AIM agent that was pretty much threatening his life the entire time?
Because you save it until you absolutely have to have it.
Creative license.
Creative license, yeah, probably is the real answer. It's probably not the best writing. It is in this scene, actually, though, that they cut some extra stuff out. Originally, Harley's bullies that are mentioned in this film were going to make an appearance, and one of them gets caught in the crossfire at this end part where the water tower comes down, and he was going to be passed out, and Tony was actually going to take out his arc reactor from his chest and use it kind of to shock the kid back to life. And in the process, Tony passes out because his arc reactor's been out too long, and Harley saves him by grabbing it and putting it back in his chest. It's an interesting scene, but I think it would have killed the emotion that the scene has currently.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Rhodey goes to the Mideast. He rescues a bunch of people, but he also unfortunately finds an AIM agent, who it looks like it was a trap all along, who takes down the Iron Patriot. Now, he takes Rhodey down, or I believe she takes Rhodey down with one move. She grabs his arm, kind of heats a little bit, and then he is down. What was that all about?
I have that exact same question. It doesn't make any sense to me. If you damage the hand or the arm, yeah, maybe the hand might not work, but you're not going to fry the electronics for the entire heads-up display. This is sloppy writing. Also, I think it's somewhere around here. It could be a little bit later. We get another one of those Mandarin attacks. Zach, is that here?
You know, it's somewhere around here. They're kind of interspersed in the movies, but close enough.
So basically, the Mandarin is calling out the president of the U.S. directly. And I'm not sure if it's here or earlier. We find out the president's name is President Ellis. Now, this is actually a reference to a comic book writer named Warren Ellis, who is the guy who wrote that original Extremis storyline, which actually did run from 2005 to 2006. We also get a couple other call-outs here. They call out Roxxon, which was also something we saw in that Marvel one-shot, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Thor's Hammer. And in the comic books, Roxxon is an oil company that provides gasoline. And also we see when the Mandarin walks in, he's wearing this cloak. And I believe that this is a direct reference to his comic book look, where he wears this like green and red cloak with different colors on it. And they've just taken that and made it look a little bit more real, dulled the colors down a little bit. But personally, I love the cloak. I kind of wish he wore it through the whole movie.
Yeah, interesting Easter eggs, and you're completely right about his costume.
So, following basically the rebranding of Iron Patriot and telling him to go look and him being captured and everything, we jump back to Tony, who has now taken the car and driven into Chattanooga. So in this scene, we find out, well, first we get our Stan Lee cameo with the, is it a Miss Christmas pageant? What kind of pageant is this?
I'm not really sure, to be honest.
It says it on the sign, but I don't really remember what it says. But he's a judge there. He holds up a number. It's kind of funny. It's not his best, but it's all right.
And this is Stan Lee that Caleb is talking about. And Caleb, did I see you as well in that scene? Because if I'm not mistaken, this is your neck of the woods.
Well, for a time, I did live in Chattanooga, which is actually why I have some insight into this scene. It's funny. Tony comes in and basically uses a computer. And he asks this guy to boost the signal. Yeah, Gary. He asks Gary to boost the internet signal. First off, I don't think that's how that works. I don't think you need to boost the internet signal. Second of all, Chattanooga actually has some of the fastest internet in the country. But ultimately, he does get the signal boosted, and we find out that Tony learns that Killian is attached to the Mandarin and is supposedly supplying the Mandarin with faulty extremis.
That's right. And it's right after this that we also jump to a hotel room, and we have Pepper and Maya having a little girl time. And Pepper basically confides in Maya. It's like, you're awesome, you rock. And somebody knocks at the door, and she goes in, and it is Killian here. Now, why did Killian travel himself to kind of attack Pepper Potts in person instead of sending one of his goonies?
I'm not sure if he's going to attack her or if he's going to retrieve Maya, because it seems like in the scene she went off on her own without telling Killian about it. And we find out that she's double-crossing Pepper. Her entire plan, I think, has been to get her to Killian, and he just didn't know that.
That's right. It's a big reveal that Maya actually went to the Stark household because he was trying to get both of them to Killian to become captured. Now, was Maya supposed to be a bigger part in this? Because she kind of has a subplot, but I have a feeling that she's supposed to play maybe a bigger part, kind of like The Dark Knight Rises.
So she was actually supposed to be originally the main villain for this film. It was in one of the drafts that Black and Pierce did. And supposedly, Marvel executives said no because they were concerned about losing money to a female villain for merchandising rights. There is one individual in that chain of command who is supposedly fairly sexist. He has since been removed from that chain of command. Now, I don't know if he was the one that said this. I don't know if anyone actually said this, but supposedly that's why she was switched from a main villain to only a supporting role. One thing in this scene is that Maya is talking to Aldrich, and they keep calling the Mandarin the Master. Now, there's a twist coming up with the Mandarin that we find out, and I'm curious who in this film actually knows the truth about that. Because if they both know, why are they calling him the Master when it seems that they both already know?
I think this is a problem that the movie just has in general, and I'm not sure if any of the writers or producers even knew who the Master or the Mandarin was during the filming, and they just kind of switched it to fit their needs.
Well, this is something that movies do a lot when there's a big mystery or there's a big twist, where if you watch it in order, it is completely fine. But if you go back and watch it, you realize people are doing things when no one else is around, so it shouldn't matter, that they would only do if other people were around. And the only reason they're doing it is because we, the audience, are watching them. But of course, in universe, they don't know that. So it's a writing trick that is not a great one.
So we get a brief scene here of the Iron Patriot, where we basically just see that Rhodey's still alive, and they get him out of the suit. He escapes. We also get a scene here of Tony driving. Now, it's at this point I would like to bring up that Jarvis has sort of been malfunctioning. We get Harley, who's on the phone, talking to Tony as he's driving, and we get that Jarvis can't fully finish his sentences correctly. Now, is Jarvis been malfunctioning due to the suit, or this, for me, didn't really make sense?
My read is that the suit ran out of power, and because it's like when your computer, if power suddenly shuts off, it can corrupt things. And so Tony says something like the voice control box or something needs to be rebooted. My issue with this is I thought that Jarvis was centrally located in his house, but this seems to suggest that it's installed everywhere independently of each other.
See, and that's why my question comes up, Caleb, because I would agree with you. I thought it was a program that came from some type of computer system that he has in his house, not directly from his suits.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, from a tactical standpoint, it would make more sense for that to be in the suit. Because if somehow your connection got lost or, 0 phone bars or something, you can't communicate to the person that's primarily piloting your suit. But still, again, I don't know. It is a little weird. It's meant more to be funny for us, and give Tony a reason why he's not in the suit.
That's right. We also get the last PTSD scene with Tony Stark here as he has to kind of exit his vehicle and catch his breath. Did that work for you?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, I don't really have an issue with any of these PTSD scenes. It's not anything I know about, so I'm fine with this. Are you not?
You know, the scene itself was okay. As I mentioned before, the premise was great. The scenes themselves didn't work for me, but there was no outcome. So this was the last scene we get, and that's it. He basically solves his PTSD on his own, right? There's no conclusion to this story arc of Tony's. It's just that his anxiety stops, which I don't have PTSD, as I mentioned, or anxiety, but what I do know is it doesn't just stop. You need some medication. You might need some counseling, maybe some event. Maybe you have a group of people that help you out, but something has to happen. It doesn't just stop. It seems like they just dropped the story arc and subplot just because they didn't have time with it. So interesting premise. It doesn't work out at all for me, and I'm not really sure why they dropped it.
I completely agree. While I don't have an issue with this episode of his attack, I have an issue with them completely dropping this. And you're right, this is the last time we see it. It never comes up again. I don't know if something happens here that is supposed to clue us in that he fixed it, because I feel like there's got to be something in here that's just not good enough, but it's there, but we don't know what it is.
Now, Caleb, you had mentioned earlier in the podcast that one of the best things about Iron Man 3 is that we kind of see him independent of his Iron Man suit. And this next scene, we see Iron Man going to Miami, Florida, or Tony Stark going to Miami, Florida, where he figured out was the compound where the Mandarin and Killian are located. And so he goes to Miami, Florida, he finds the compound, and he sneaks in. And I thought this was probably the best fight scene / just the best scene in general of the movie, because you see Tony and he's infiltrating the compound without a suit. So he has gone to like a supermart and has rigged up all these different items, kind of like he did in Iron Man 1, and then he uses them to take over the compound. I thought that was pretty nifty.
Yeah, and you said exactly what I was thinking. It's a lot like that scene in Iron Man 1 where he's building the first suit of armor.
Now he gets into the deep levels of this compound, and it is here that we get our major twist in this movie.
The Mandarin, the guy with the beard and the glasses that we've seen throughout the entire movie, that they've marketed for this entire movie, is not the Mandarin. We find out he is an actor named Trevor Slattery.
Caleb, I went into this movie with one eye, and they took out my good eye. What I mean by that is I did not have a lot of expectations, and this... I don't know what to say.
So I take it you don't like this.
Like the majority of comic book fans and a lot of the audience in general, this was a twist that, okay, I'm okay with twists, but it just didn't work out at all. So as you mentioned, we found out the Mandarin is Trevor Slattery or Slater?
Slattery.
Slattery, who is a British actor and was hired by Killian because Killian has found out the secret of power. You can never be the man up front. It's all very convoluted, and I mean, this is Iron Man's greatest enemy in the comics, and all he was a switchbait.
So I don't feel it was convoluted. I actually think this makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be someone that's terrorizing the world, don't put your face out there so everybody knows what you look like. That makes sense to me. This twist, I'm a fan of. Now, I know that this movie split audiences in a big way. You have the comic book fans, which for the most part, hate this movie for this exact reason. They made the Mandarin, in their mind, a joke. Then you have the general audience, which for the most part, didn't care. They had no expectations for this villain, and a lot of them actually really liked this twist. And while I'm a comic book fan, I'm in that ballpark, right? It is something new that they've never done before, and it came out of nowhere, and it played into the story, and I really liked it.
I do enjoy that this is new and that they tried something different, it didn't work for me at all. But Caleb, this is interesting because I remember the first time this movie came out, and I remember calling you when we talked about it, and you hated this reveal with a passion, and I actually was fairly okay with it. It's interesting now that a couple years later, I hate it with a passion, and you're okay with it.
Yeah, well, that's what time does to you, right? 2020.
So after this major reveal, unfortunately, Iron Man becomes captured. So he wakes up and he's kind of chained somewhere, and Killian's there as well as Maya. So Tony Stark sees that, they're both evil. He kind of starts connecting the dots of everything. And we also get the reveal that Killian, by capturing Pepper, has injected her with Extremis.
We talked about in the last podcast, Iron Man 2, that Tony was going around and, he's Iron Man, and then in Iron Man 1, he was just offing people. And we talked about how that doesn't really follow through the MCU. I was actually very surprised. I didn't remember. In this movie, Tony kills a lot of people. And he doesn't just kill them, he brags about it. Here, when he's captured, he's bragging how much he's going to kill these guys. And there's a deleted scene with, 20 or 30 takes that kind of went on for too long of him telling them how many ways he's going to kill them. And some of it is just brutal. This is not what I would expect out of an MCU movie.
Yeah, somebody needs to do a kill count. Now, before he's bragging to these soldiers about killing them, we actually get a little scene of Maya who turns good for a brief moment. Tony somehow convinces her to turn good. It doesn't really make sense. And not only does her turning good not make sense, but after she tells Killian, all right, I'm going to basically kill myself and then you can't unlock Extremis, Killian shoots her. Okay, so her sacrifice doesn't make sense because I don't get why she just turned good, other than basically Tony's entire idea was, hey, my current girlfriend Pepper, she's hot and she's actually really good and you're not, so you should turn good. And Maya's like, okay, I'm good now. Number two, she just stated that Killian needed her to unlock everything that was going on with Extremis, and Killian offs her without a second thought. What are your thoughts on both of those?
The turn was not earned. 100%, you're exactly right about that. As far as Killian killing her, I don't have an issue with it. I view that as, like when you have a key person a lot of times in movies, and they develop something and they think they're super important. But at a certain point, they're not so important anymore, and it can be done without them. That's kind of what I thought was happening here. She thought she's needed. Killian realizes he doesn't actually need her, and so it doesn't matter if she dies or not. Yeah, it might be an inconvenience, but it's more of an inconvenience if she sets Tony free and he takes all of them in, or kills them.
So it's after her sacrifice that Harley is able to power up this armor, send it to Tony, who breaks out, and is also able to find Rhodey, and they escape the compound, grab a boat, and then kind of head out. And it's here we also have a couple scenes. We have the scenes on the boat with Rhodey and Tony, and we also have scenes on Air Force One. And it's up to this point that we've seen some of the president, but we kind of get this interesting kind of final act turn where it focuses on the president as well as this vice president subplot. Was it just me, or did this all come out of left field?
It did come out of left field, but not in a bad way for me. This is similar to another movie in Phase 2, where there are some things revealed about certain people. Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And I didn't have an issue with it. I think the first time I saw it, it did catch me off guard, and it was strange. But, whatever. What about you?
Yeah, again, a lot of things in this movie didn't work for me. This was another one of those pieces, this plot, right? So we saw the president, makes some sense, and okay, I get that they have to do something different now that Mandarin reveal happened, and the Mandarin has been gunning for the president, so that makes sense that they would go to try to capture the president. But then throwing in the fact that the vice president is evil and a part of AIM, okay, makes some sense, but both of those didn't really carry any weight. Because once they started talking about the president and vice president, my mind went to, action movie trope. I've seen this 1,000 different times. Yeah,
I could see that. It probably could have been better. And And so it's around this point that the Iron Patriot is co-opted. They have the suit, and Saban, I think is his name, jumps in it, and he goes and he meets the president on Air Force One, but they think that is Rhodey.
Yeah, this was kind of a cool scene as Savian just dismantles all the Secret Service guards that were on Air Force One.
Ultimately, he gets to the president and he captures him.
That's right. And after capturing the president, we thankfully get Iron Man to save the president. Now, he's a little too late because the president is somehow able to get inside of the Iron Patriot armor. Caleb, was that ever explained?
No, this wasn't ever explained. I'm assuming that the suit has the same thing that Tony's suit has, where it can just open up and you can walk in and out of it.
It's here that Eric Saban is killed by Iron Man. He just blasts him through the chest, and which goes back to the point you made, Caleb, that that was a very brutal execution by Tony Stark. And he realizes that people are falling out of the airplane, and in what I think is a very Superman-esque moment, he flies down and saves everybody who is falling out of the airplane in like a skydiving formation.
So, Zach, this is a scene that they actually did for real. They actually took a bunch of people and jumped out of an airplane to shoot this, which was a crazy thing to do. It had never been done before. And I feel like, I mean, this looks amazing, but I don't know if it worked because they ended up having to replace all of the backgrounds, because between all the different shots they had when people were falling, the ground was at different elevations and it wasn't looking right. So they kept the actors and all their hair moving and everything, but they replaced the backgrounds, which seems like a lot of work to me when you're jumping out of an airplane. But anyway, I thought this scene was fairly kinetic. I enjoyed it this time. The first time I saw this movie, I thought this was lame. I was like, dude, where's the Monaco Grand Prix? Where's the whips? Where's the Oracle Dome and all the drones? Because this is the big action scene for this movie. The one of them. And I didn't like it. This time, I think it's perfectly serviceable, but it's not amazing to a crazy extent.
Yeah, it looks like a green screen scene, but it works.
And so he saves them, and he flies off, and his suit gets dismantled by hitting a truck. And that's when Rhodey comes in and basically grabs him so they can make it to the final battle.
That's right. And you find out that Tony Stark wasn't in the suit. He was just controlling it via a headset that he had done earlier when Pepper Potts came to his house.
So fast forward, and they find Aldrich Killian's new base of operations where he has the president basically strung up in the Iron Patriot armor in the middle of this freight boat, I think is what it is. And before we get into this, Zach, I have a big question. Why didn't the president figure out how to use the suit? We find out later in the scene the suit is fully operational. It never looks like he makes any effort to struggle or try to get out with the suit on.
Well, and that brings up another question. You said it's fully operational. Is it? Because it was destroyed when Rhodey was in it, but then we see it fly away again. So first, how was it repaired so that it was usable again after apparently crushing its arm destroyed it? Which would be my first question. And two, to answer your question, maybe he doesn't know anything about the suit and simply can't.
To respond to your question, a lot of questions here today. Look, that was a dumb way to damage the suit. But assuming that's what caused it, maybe it's only because it's overheating, right? Like a computer. It only has issues when it's overheating. With that assumption, we have had 2 or 3 people at this point in the MCU put on a suit for the first time and be able to use it, right? We had Obadiah Stane in the first movie, who could use it pretty well. We had Rhodey in the second movie, who could use it pretty well. In this movie, we have Pepper, who can use it pretty well. I feel like the president can at least figure out how to shoot a repulsor ray.
That's very true. It seems like Tony Stark is the only person that needs a training montage or a whole movie, Iron Man 1, just to figure out how to use the suit.
And I also have another question here, Zach, because we jump to Killian with Pepper for a few moments, and he's explaining to her his plan, and he says something to the effect of, I own the war on terror, and I own terror itself, and I'm going to take out the president, and then the Mandarin can be president. That doesn't make any sense. What's his real plan?
Caleb, this is why the Mandarin twist doesn't ultimately work, because Killian's plan is your typical villain trope. His plan is to simply control, have world dominance, possibly have an enemy of the state that's so big that his company becomes bigger through extremists, and thus he is able to become super rich. No matter which angle you look at it, it is a classic villain MCU trope, and taking the Mandarin out of it, it's still the same sort of movie. And so they wasted one of the best villains for Iron Man, and replaced it with Killian, who still has this same ideology. So to answer your question, Caleb, I have no idea. It doesn't work. It sucks.
Okay, well, we'll move on.
It's here where Rhodey and Tony Stark kind of get into trouble, and Tony Stark initiates House Party Protocol.
So this was actually initiated a scene or two back, I believe, in my notes.
Correct.
That's how I have it listed. And they're just now showing up because they're in Florida, so they have to fly almost literally as far away as they can in the U.S. to get there. Now, one of the complaints about this movie is, why didn't he activate this sooner? Like, why didn't he activate it when his house was under attack? And I think I have the answer for this viewing.
I would just complain about it, so go ahead, tell me.
There's a scene at one point before this where Jarvis tells him that the debris has been removed from some area, and it shows a shot, and they're pulling up the debris from his Hall of Armors that we get a sneak peek of earlier in the film. So my thought is that when the house is attacked, there's debris on top of it. He can't actually call it at that point. When it is cleared, it's like the very next scene where he activates the House Party Protocol. And so as soon as he can, he does use it.
Well, I don't have much time to get into it, but I do believe that the House Party Protocol is actually somewhat in the comics, in that Tony Stark controls a bunch of his Iron Man suits. Anyway, in the comics, there are actually, I believe, 53 different models, and Iron Man is currently on model 51.
So in this universe, he's obviously wearing the newest one, Mark 42, and so they all fly in, and we kind of find out all these suits are autonomous at this point, which is something that plays in, again, to the Avengers Age of Ultron movie with his drones in that film. But each of these suits are all different.
And I remember that this was somewhat of a big reveal, Caleb, because you get one of these suits that runs over as a shipping container starts to fall and lifts it up and kind of straightens its like awesome backbone technology, whatever it is. And I remember the talk was that was the bulkiest armor and kind of looked like a Hulk Buster armor.
Yeah, this was something that a lot of people were like, oh, look, it's the Hulk Buster. As we know now, it's not. And I think they were even saying it wasn't at the time. Some of these suits have code names. That one's name is Igor, which makes sense because it's kind of hunched over like Igor. We also have the Heartbreaker suit. And Mark 33 specifically is one to note. It's the one that Tony actually jumps in first because it is the Silver Centurion armor, which is actually a model from the comics. Model 8 in the comics that he wore for a long time. It's got this sort of V shape to the chest. And I'd never noticed it before. I saw it this time and I'm like, hey, wait a minute. That looks like that one armor. And sure enough, it is. And it's actually called that for this movie.
And so as Rhodey goes to save the president, Iron Man, Tony Stark, jumps into these Iron Man suits and battles his way to Pepper Potts. When he finally reaches Pepper Potts, she, through different scenes, has kind of fallen down. And they're over now a fire that has exploded. And I believe at that point, Rhodey's actually already saved the president too. So he saved the president and he gets into his own suit and flies off to secure the president. So it's really just Tony Stark now and Pepper Potts. And Tony Stark's like, jump, Pepper, I got you. And so she goes for it. And Tony Stark just misses by a mile.
Well, I don't think she actually gets the chance to jump. I think she falls beforehand.
Okay, I didn't catch that. To me, it seemed like it was a combo. She fell, but she also was like reaching out, and Tony Stark should have caught her, but missed.
Well, In any case, he definitely doesn't catch her, and she falls to her apparent death. Now, we see in the next couple of minutes, she didn't die, she comes right back. And Zach, this did not work for me at all. This is something that Marvel has continuously done since this movie, and maybe even some Phase 1 movies, is fake one of their characters' deaths. And anytime a character dies now, I'm not sure if I am going to believe it, because there's several movies that have done this. And not only does she come back, but it doesn't feel that emotional. When she falls, we should be crying because we have been with this character for 4 movies now, right? And so we should feel that emotional weight. Even after that happens, I don't know if it's until she comes back, but Tony cracks some jokes. He should not be in any state to crack jokes. He should be incredibly furious.
You know, Robert Downey Jr., through this whole movie, I thought his acting was honestly subpar. Just through the anxiety attacks, through what we've gotten Tony Stark, watching Iron Man 1, Iron Man 2, and the Avengers, like in the last 4 weeks, and then watching this movie, I thought this was probably the worst his acting or just portrayal of Iron Man. And so, Caleb, I agree with you, and I think a lot of this falls on Robert Downey Jr. He acts shocked and surprised for like the first 5-10 seconds, and I felt a little of that. But then you're right, I just felt like his character didn't mourn the death of Pepper, and then she's back in like 2 minutes, and so you didn't get to feel any of that.
And see, I fault the script more with the issue, because I feel like they purposely did it this way, and it was just not a satisfying way to do it.
And so Tony Stark is getting beaten up by Killian. He's about to take him out when Pepper Potts returns from the fire because she has this extremis, so she's able to withstand this ultimate heat, and apparently also falling like 100 feet off the ground, which I guess we'll have to kind of ignore. And she returns with a vengeance. Now, I have no problem with a woman heroine being amazing, but how did Pepper Potts learn all this agility? Because she like takes out Killian with a few karate moves, and then she like throws a weapon and fires some projection either from her hand or a repulsor beam. I can't remember which, and it blows up, right? So she like does all these amazing moves all in one, but we've never ever gotten the hint that she like knows karate, that she has the agility to do something like this. So for me, this kind of comes out to left field. Again, I have no problem with something like that, but it doesn't fit her character.
And I just chalk this up to the extremis being in her system. There's no in-movie explanation for this. Maybe you could argue that she's the type of person that would take self-defense classes, and we just don't see it. But there's not a clear explanation.
Now, Caleb, I would like to make a prediction for Infinity War. In our last podcast, I made a previous prediction of what happens in Infinity War, and I would like to make another one. In my prediction, you could say this is a minor spoiler, but I do believe that Pepper Potts will die.
Why do you say that?
So if you watch the Infinity War trailer, you see somebody in an Iron Man suit. This person in the Iron Man suit, Thanos hits extremely hard, and just like the person crumples to the ground. Now, this doesn't fit what we've seen how Tony Stark pilots the Iron Man suit. So I believe somebody else is in the Iron Man suit, and I believe that's Pepper Potts. We also see in these trailers that Tony Stark is mourning that something has happened, which means somebody has died, something terrible has happened. And I believe the only person that would elicit that emotion would be Pepper Potts, and that this time they gave him a second chance to really act that up with a decent script, and I think it'll work well. So that is my prediction, that Pepper Potts will not last in the Infinity War movie. She will die.
You heard it here, folks. So, Zach, as you mentioned, she pretty much takes out Killian. You mentioned earlier that you think Fin Fang Foom is in this film, and afterwards I don't see a great spot for him to show up. Where did he show up in this film?
Yeah, Caleb, so this is actually a fan theory. I thought this immediately after I watched the film, and rewatching it, I still think it is. So, as I mentioned before, Fin Fang Foom is a giant green monster from the planet of Maklan. Now, in the comics, there's some comparisons to him and, in this movie, Killian. So I believe Fin Fang Foom is actually Killian, or Killian is Fin Fang Foom. For one, they both breathe fire. we didn't mention this yet, but in a scene we see that Killian is able to breathe fire and nobody else with the extremis is able to do that. Second, once Killian has his shirt off, which he kind of has these miraculous Hulk pants that somehow stay on, to keep this PG for the kids. And he has dragon tattoos that are covering his body, which I think is, again, a call out to Fin Fang Foom. Finally, in the comics, Fin Fang Foom can shapeshift, which means that in the MCU, it could theoretically be possible that Killian is not Killian, but is actually a giant green dragon.
So what you're saying is he chose to look like that mess in the 90s?
What I'm saying is at this point, Killian has not found his extremis 10 rings something or another, and later he gets this change from a junior high look because he is this giant green monster now. Boom, issue solved.
All right, whatever you say.
Now, whether you believe me or not, what we do have to cover is Killian has an interesting statement before he dies.
Yes, and that's where I was going to go next, is he tells them that he's the Mandarin.
Why did they throw that in? They've already proven who the Mandarin was, and it feels like this was thrown in to appease comic book fans. But again, that makes no sense that he had somebody be the Mandarin, but then he really is the Mandarin, but then the real Mandarin dies. And we're going to mention after the movie, but that's not it for the Mandarin as well.
I don't know, Zach. I mean, the Mandarin's just a title. I could say I'm the Mandarin. Does that make me the Mandarin? No. But it really doesn't matter.
And so in the ending, we get a couple scenes. The first one is that I believe Tony Stark says something to the effect of Pepper Potts does no longer has her abilities, correct?
Yeah, he says very quickly in this ending scene that he almost solved this, 20 years ago or however long, which is true. He gave Maya the formula to get it where it was, and he thinks it would be fairly easily to remove it from her. And thus he does.
Now, not only that, but Tony gets a procedure done that basically means he no longer needs his arc reactor because the shrapnel is taken out of his chest. However, isn't this retconned for the next movie?
I don't think this is retconned, but this is the thing I was talking about at the very beginning of the podcast with the Doctor. If he was able to do this, why didn't he do this right when he came back? Why did he keep the arc reactor in him at all? And you find out in some of those Chinese scenes, it's because of this special doctor that he's just found out about that this can even be attempted. And it's that doctor at the beginning in 1999, Dr. Wu, who actually performs the surgery and is able to do it successfully. Following the surgery, we have a scene where Tony goes to his busted up house. He throws the arc reactor in the ocean, and he has this ending monologue. And Zach, this movie starts with a monologue and it ends with a monologue, and I am a big fan of both. The first one sets up what happens. It has a quote in there that says, "We create our own demons," which is a central theme in this movie. And then we end with one talking about how you start with things and you have pure intentions and then they get twisted and then things just go really bad. And it's great. It sums up this movie. It's also a real life lesson that happens all the time. But there's also a lot of implications in this ending. He throws away the arc reactor and he walks away and he's leaving. And when I saw this, I thought, is he not going to be Iron Man anymore? And, you know, what's going to happen to him? And in fact, if you look it up, at the end of this, he says, "I am Iron Man." Originally, it was scripted. He was supposed to say, "I am Tony Stark."
Wasn't it this point that Robert Downey Jr. also came to some contractual obligations that he had to no longer fill, or that it was no longer going to be extended, or something around?
Yeah, this was the end of his current contract. So it would have made complete sense for them to say he's not Iron Man anymore, because it's the end of his contract. He's been in the Avengers. He's completed his trilogy. And so I didn't know what this was going to mean. Did you have any of these same thoughts when you saw it?
No, I was just glad the movie was over. But I would have to agree that I believe that the narration was a great move and something I really enjoyed in this movie. And it is the only MCU movie to date that has had narration for the whole extent of the movie, if I'm correct.
Yes, I think Thor Ragnarok has a little bit at the beginning, but it's kind of revealed that it's not actually narration. But yes, you're totally correct through the whole movie. Following this, we get a montage that sums up pretty much the entire trilogy, which also gave me thoughts of maybe this is the end for him. But I think that this is a fantastic way to cap off the trilogy.
Now, as the credits roll after them, we actually learn that this wasn't a narration, but the entire time Tony Stark was actually trying to tell Bruce Banner all of his thoughts, because Bruce Banner's a doctor, so he must be a psychiatrist.
Yeah, and while this scene was funny, this was my first disappointment with the Marvel after the credits scenes. To date, at that point, all of them had built up to something, right? We had Nick Fury and Iron Man. In the Incredible Hulk, we had Tony Stark coming to General Ross. In Iron Man 2, we had the tease for Thor. In Thor, we have the tease of Eric Selvig and Nick Fury with the Tesseract. In Captain America, we had the tease of Avengers, and at the end of Avengers, we had the tease of Thanos. So it's all building up to something bigger. And then this movie, they take all that and they make a big joke out of it.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I think it still follows kind of the trope that the Avengers set, where the first end credit scene right after the initial credits is something that builds, and the last scene is something that's more humorous, right? We got that in the Avengers, where the first end credit scene was kind of world building. The last one, shawarma, was just funny. This just omitted that first scene, and the last one was humorous. So Caleb, this wraps up the movie. So when we take a step back and look at it, how did this movie do critically and commercially? Was it a success or a failure?
This movie was irrevocably a success. This was probably the most anticipated Marvel movie when it was released. Avengers built up a lot of anticipation, but because Avengers was so good, I think that it actually built this movie up higher. I remember going to the premiere for this, and I got there at least an hour early, and I still had to wait in this massive, massive line to get in, and I wasn't sure if I was going to get in. This scene had a budget of $200 million, which was actually, I believe, originally $150, and they bumped it up when the Avengers did so well. It grossed worldwide $1.2 billion. It is the second Marvel movie to cross $1 billion after the Avengers, of course. And it was received fairly well. Maybe not as well as the rest in the trilogy. On Rotten Tomatoes, currently, it sits at a 79%, and Metacritic has it at a 62. It is the highest grossing film ever at the time of release. And also the highest grossing Iron Man movie, as well as threequel. And it won 14 different awards.
So it's obvious that the general audience loved this movie. But it's interesting to point out that the comic book audience, kind of our audience, didn't necessarily actually enjoy this movie at all.
Yeah, and a lot of that, like we mentioned, comes down to that Mandarin twist. I mean, it's kind of like if you went into a Spider-Man movie and the Green Goblin was the villain, and you found out the Green Goblin isn't a villain at all. Or maybe like if you go to a Spider-Man movie and the villain's supposed to be the Sandman, and then you realize, wait a minute, the Sandman's not a villain at all. I mean, who would do that, Zach?
No idea, Caleb. No idea. Actually, I do have an idea. But with Iron Man 3 becoming an unequivocal success, why is there no Iron Man 4?
Well, Zach, as you mentioned, this was the end of Robert Downey Jr.'s contract at the time. Obviously, he has appeared in at least 3 different movies since then. Those movies are Civil War, Captain America Civil War, Avengers Age of Ultron, and Spider-Man Homecoming. I believe with each film, those were negotiated independently. The only exception could be Captain America, the Civil War, and Avengers Age of Ultron. But I'm still pretty sure that each of those were done independently. So basically, he can say no, he doesn't want to return at any point. Marvel has also spent a lot of time expanding their characters, especially in these last few years, to include new ones, so that when original characters that have been around for a while, like Tony Stark, expire, their contracts expire, they have other characters they can lean on. Because they have been introducing those, they just don't have a spot in their schedule for Iron Man 4. And as of a year or two ago, there still were not any plans to do an Iron Man 4.
So, Caleb, when we look at this movie in general, what would you say is the legacy of Iron Man 3?
Well, this movie kind of set the tone for Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I mentioned previously, I think 2013 is their weakest year to date. And this set the tone for that. Yes, it was financially successful, but it's still not as good as other movies they had released prior, in a lot of people's opinion. In terms of what it did for audiences, I don't know if it really had that much of an effect, to be honest. If you had talked to someone in 2013 or 2014 about it, they would totally mention the Mandarin. If you talk to someone now, I don't know if they would really remember this movie, because it just doesn't have those big action set pieces that people tend to remember. Really, we have the scene where there's the 13 people falling and he catches them, and we have the scene at the very end. The scene at the end is cool, but it doesn't seem to have very much impact, and so people don't remember it. So I feel that this movie, for the most part, is fairly forgotten.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Going into Infinity War, it will be interesting when they bring Pepper Potts back. We know she will be a character in that movie, but if they bring her back with some type of powers, if they bring her back with an Iron Man suit, I don't think anybody will really connect it with Iron Man 3. They're going to be like, oh, cool, that's kind of new.
And similarly, they're actually bringing back Ty Simpkins for the Avengers Infinity War. I don't know in how large of a role, but he's going to be in it.
Well, he was probably the best actor in this movie, so I'm okay with that.
Oh, ouch.
Just kidding. Robert Downey Jr. did all right. The others did pretty well. I actually really like Ben Kingsley, so the cast did okay.
So, Zach, with this movie, as with the past several, we have a new one-shot. This is Marvel's fourth, and it is called Agent Carter.
I thought this was a really interesting one-shot because up until this point, all the other one-shots tied into the greater universe. While this kind of tied into the greater universe, I thought it was more of kind of a one-shot that was really a one-shot. It stood on its own.
I agree. The only way it really connects is the fact that it takes place a year after the first Avenger, and Peggy Carter is kind of mourning the loss of Steve, and she's trying to figure out her place in what I think is a strategic scientific reserve, and dealing with sexism, which was fairly rampant at the time. Now, there's a couple of Easter eggs in this thing. The biggest one is Zodiac. Are you familiar with Zodiac?
Sounds familiar, but why don't you go ahead and remind me?
So in the comics, there is something called Zodiac, right? It's been multiple different things. It's been a group of characters. It's been different groups of characters. It's been single characters. So it's hard to pin down exactly what Zodiac is, but it's something that has reoccurred in the Marvel comics for a very long time. In Agent Carter, the one-shot, Zodiac is the enemy that she's trying to go and stop. Their symbol is actually seen on the vial that she pulls out at one point. And so it's trying to build out that larger idea without going directly into it.
All right, so we know about Zodiac. But how much does this actually play into the TV show, since I've never seen it?
So, Zach, this one-shot ends with Howard Stark calling her boss and telling him to tell Carter that she's going to come run S.H.I.E.L.D. with him. This causes some issues with the TV show. And as far as I can tell, this has no good place in the MCU. You can count the one-shot as canon, or you can count the TV show as canon. If you try to count them both, it gets really, really messy. So the way I like to think about this is Agent Carter is a pilot, a test run to see if it was going to work. The real thing is the Agent Carter TV show. But in terms of the tone It is spot on. They are pretty much exactly the same. The production values of both are very high. Haley Atwell is phenomenal in both of them. And I think that if the one shot didn't do well, there would definitely not be an Agent Carter TV show.
So that one shot was produced before the TV show was launched.
Yes, definitely.
Well, Caleb, to close us out, we have now entered phase 2, which means in the past few weeks, we have covered 7 movies when you include Iron Man 3. Why don't you go ahead and remind us your current ranking of those 7 movies? Well, of those 6 movies, and then tell us, where does Iron Man 3 fall into that ranking?
So, Zach, this movie, it's a hard one. I enjoy this movie, but it came out after the Avengers. I don't think whatever you put out after the Avengers is going to feel satisfying, because the Avengers upped the scale for everything. So, I don't know. This movie is very different from all the other Iron Man movies that came before it. We talked about all the other ones feature a lot of AC/DC songs. This one doesn't have a single AC/DC song. It's very character-centric. It's very light on actual Iron Man. It's a different director. It's a different tone. But I appreciate those things. I feel like those are good things. When I'm watching this, for this viewing, I felt that I enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to, based on my memory. But I think it maybe drags a little bit in parts. There's parts that I feel maybe don't make sense. The ones we've talked about, the plot holes. I don't have an issue with the Mandarin twist. I actually think the Mandarin twist is a really smart idea and is very bold to do. So I kind of put this in the ballpark of like a Thor, Captain America, or somewhere around there. And so I have an issue figuring out where to place it. I think I'm going to put this right above The Incredible Hulk. Although I feel like it could also potentially go underneath The Incredible Hulk. Because when I think about the movies that I would want to watch again, especially right now after having just watched them, this is not very high on that list at all. And you know what? I changed my mind. I'm actually going to put this below The Incredible Hulk. Because I think I would actually watch The Incredible Hulk again before I would watch this film again. And similarly to some of my other ones, I think it could switch places with The Incredible Hulk depending on the day and my mood. So last week, my ratings, starting with number 1, was Avengers, Iron Man, Thor at number 3, Captain America at number 4, The Incredible Hulk at number 5, and Iron Man 2 at number 6. And I am going to place this below The Incredible Hulk, which brings my list to number 1, The Avengers, best Marvel movie at that point, number 2, Iron Man, number 3, Thor, number 4, Captain America, the first Avenger, number 5, The Incredible Hulk, number 6, Iron Man 3, and number 7, Iron Man 2, which means 2 out of the 3 Iron Man films are at the bottom of my list.
Caleb, that's really interesting because throughout this whole podcast, I've kind of been the Debbie Downer on Iron Man 3 when you've pointed out a lot of the shining points of this movie. I thought you would have ranked this a lot higher than you did.
Well, I feel like maybe I'm trying to defend this film because it does have such a bad rap in the fan community. And I do really enjoy this film, but it's not a film that you just want to sit down and watch time and time again. It's more one of those films that you sit down and watch once or twice, and you don't really see it again, mostly because it is so character-centric. There's not very much action to carry you through when you know what the plot is.
And Caleb, I think you just set the mood for some of the movies in Phase 2. Because looking at your list, the first Iron Man is fairly high. Thor is, I believe, fairly high in your list, and Captain America is not as high as those two. However, my assumption is, and you're already kind of proving that with where you listed Iron Man 3, is that going into Phase 2, you would assume that Thor and the third Iron Man would be ranked really high, and Captain America, the second one, would be ranked low. But my assumption is that that's actually going to be flipped completely on its head.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
So looking at my list of movies, last week I had Avengers number 1, Iron Man number 2, Captain America number 3, love that movie. Thor number 4, Iron Man 2 number 5, and then The Incredible Hulk is at the bottom of my list at number 6. So Caleb, I can sum up Iron Man 3 in 2 words. Hate it. Now, I had only seen this movie once in theaters, and watching it again, I told my wife, Michaela, I was like, I don't really remember this movie. After watching it, I basically stated, there's a reason I don't remember this movie. My psyche blocked it. I watched this once, and I had no intention, no desire to actually ever own this movie or come back and watch it again. For me, a lot of things in this movie fail. The PTSD storyline had no completion and for me was just a disaster. The whole Mandarin twist, I'm on board with a lot of the fan community. They could have done so much more with this. And Caleb, I said we'd mention this. We really didn't talk about it, but Marvel has actually retconned this and stated that there is a true Mandarin in the MCU. How they're going to really work around that, no idea, but Marvel even sees how much they messed up with this movie. Maya, her sacrifice didn't work out. Pepper Potts, I thought the ending with her didn't work out. The Extremis storyline didn't work out. Robert Downey Jr.'s acting wasn't up to par. I loved him in the Avengers movie. He felt like Tony Stark. Here, he didn't feel like Tony Stark. It didn't gel well with me. I didn't like anything they did with the suits. I thought they could have chosen a lot better storyline if they went with the storyline of how Tony Stark goes down alcoholism after this. Instead of going with the PTSD, why not do that? I know they had a little of it in Iron Man 2, but go down that storyline. There's so much depth and so much content they could have pulled from the comics that they simply ignored. The only good thing in this movie is Harvey. Harvey and Tony's relationship, while some people hated him because he was a kid, I thought was excellent. Other than that, I just hated this movie. And so obviously you're thinking, okay, where at the bottom of this list does this movie go? And I had to debate that. If I lined up The Incredible Hulk, which is at the bottom of my list, and Iron Man 3, which one would I watch first? The Incredible Hulk is a much better movie, more entertaining. Iron Man 3, on the other hand, connects to the MCU. However, I would still rather watch The Incredible Hulk, even though they switched out the actors, and even though it doesn't really connect to the MCU, over Iron Man 3 any day. So that means my list is Avengers number 1, great movie. Iron Man is number 2. Captain America is number 3. Thor is number 4. Iron Man 2 as number 5, which means Incredible Hulk is number 6. And a new low, a new bottom of my list is Iron Man 3. Caleb, I don't know when I'll watch this movie again. Probably never, to be honest.
Ooh.
I know, and it just did not work out.
Well, you said your piece, and I can't argue with it.
All right, well, Caleb, after my 10 minutes of ranting, we now have our rankings. And if you're listening to this podcast, we would actually really like to know your rankings. So feel free to comment on one of our Facebook posts, on Twitter, Instagram, or leave us a rating on iTunes and tell us how you feel.
Well, Zach, as always, before we go, we need to say thank you to Taylor Poole for our awesome opening theme. He does fantastic musical work, and he is a wonderful guy, and you can find him at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com.
Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Iron Man 3. We would love to hear your comments or feedback, which you can leave us at cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or any other major social networking or podcasting sites. And we would love it if you could leave us a rating on iTunes. Join us next week as we discuss Thor, The Dark World. After getting portrayed as the villain in Avengers, what does Loki's new story arc look like? Will Thor and Jane Foster's relationship expand in this movie? And is Thor, The Dark World better than the awful Iron Man 3? Find out these answers and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War. Stay nerdy.